Rukia was only 21 years old. As a newlywed, she had moved to Perth, 35 hours away from her hometown in Shepparton, Australia. Her brother Taki grew worried when he hadn't heard from her for days. He dialed her number. The voice on the other end wasn't Rukia, it was her husband, Muhammad Ali Halimi, and his tone was cold. Taki cautiously asked about his sister. Halimi's response cut like a knife. "Mind your own business and forget about her." He then began hurling curses at Taki. In the background, Taki heard Rukia's voice, soft but firm, asking who her husband was swearing at. Halimi turned on her, yelling, swearing. The phone call escalated, and then silence. 10 minutes later, Taki's phone rang. It was Halimi. What he said would haunt Taki forever. "Come and take your sister's dead body. I'm going to the police station." What happened behind closed doors? How did a beautiful young bride end up dead just 6 weeks after her wedding? This is the story of Ruqia Haidari, her life, her struggles, and her tragic end. Ruqia Haidari belonged to the Hazara community in Afghanistan, a group that had faced brutal persecution for decades, particularly under Taliban rule. The youngest of 5 children, she was born in Afghanistan in 1999, just a month before her father was killed by the Taliban, leaving her mother, Sakina Muhammad Jan, no choice but to flee the country with her children. The family eventually settled in Shepparton, Victoria, Australia, joining a close-knit Afghan Hazara community. Life in Australia offered a new beginning, but the weight of cultural expectations followed them. Among her siblings, Ruqia shared a special bond with her brother Taki. They were inseparable growing up. At just 15, Ruqia was pressured into an arranged marriage, a union that crumbled 2 years later, ending in divorce. For Ruqia, the ordeal had been enough. She made it clear to her family that a second marriage was out of question, at least until she was 27 or 28. With the weight of that chapter behind her, life finally started to feel normal again. Ruqia threw herself into school, eager to rebuild her future. She began to love her independence, dreaming of studying further and getting a job, and a life she could call her own. But at home, her mother, Sakina, was restless. In their community, a divorce could stain not just a woman's reputation, but her family's honor. After Ruqia's divorce, the community began to view her as someone with a tainted reputation, made her less desirable as a future bride, but also cast shame on her mother and family. The whispers of Ruqia never being able to find a husband were growing louder, and Sakina, feeling the weight of their disapproval, believed the only way to restore their family's reputation was to marry Ruqia off again quickly. On June 1st, 2019, Ruqia was introduced to her future husband, Muhammad Ali Halimi. Sakina may have thought she was acting in her daughter's best interest, but she ignored Ruqia's wishes, her desperate pleas not to be married again. For Ruqia, the battle between her dreams and her family's expectations was only just beginning. Sakina told Ruqia, "I am your mother. I know what's best for you." By the very next day, Ruqia's unease had turned to quiet desperation. She began confiding in those she trusted, her friends, her driving instructor, her teachers, anyone who would listen. Eventually, her fear reached the ears of social worker Kerry Young, someone who truly saw what was happening. Kerry knew this wasn't just a reluctant bride. This was a young woman being coerced into marriage against her will. She contacted the police, raising the alarm and hoping to pull Ruqia out of a life she didn't choose. In August 2019, 2 Australian police officers sat with Ruqia for nearly 4 hours. They listened to her story, offered her solutions, and extended support. But every option came with a devastating cost, implicating her family. For Ruqia, the thought of betraying her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything and raised her children alone after their father's death, was unthinkable. Tears welled in her eyes as she sat in silence, weighing freedom against loyalty. She couldn't bring herself to speak the words that might save her. For her, protecting her family's honor mattered more than her own suffering. She refused their help. According to Taki, Halimi seemed like a normal, respectful person. By January 2020, Rukia and Halimi's marriage was celebrated in a grand ceremony at a sports centre in Shepperton. 500 guests gathered to mark what should have been a joyous union. But for Rukia, it felt like anything but. The next day she left for Perth with Halimi. 15 long hours away from her family, her friends, and everything familiar. This video would become the last video she ever shared with her friends on Snapchat. Soon after the move, things took a darker turn. Communication with Rukia became strained. Calls grew infrequent. When they did speak, Rukia's voice was distant, her words carefully chosen. Then, Halimi sent this video to Rukia's family, complaining about her laziness and her failure to keep the house clean and cook for him. He mocked her upbringing, casting shame on her in the eyes of the very people she loved most. The family grew uneasy. Something was wrong. It had been weeks since Taki, Rukia's beloved brother, had last heard from her. Concern gnawed at him until he couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the phone and called his sister. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. Growing anxious, Taki dialed Halimi's number. He picked up, visibly irritated. Taki inquired about his sister. The voice on the other end was sharp, seething with irritation. "It's none of your business. Mind your own life and forget about her," Halimi snapped. The calm cracked into rage. Halimi began yelling, swearing, his voice rising like a storm. In the background, Taki heard a faint, familiar voice. "Who are you swearing at? Who's on the phone?" It was Rukia. She had just woken up, her voice confused, challenging her husband. The line suddenly went dead. Silence. 10 minutes later, Taki's phone rang. It was Halimi. The words that came out of his mouth froze Taki in place, the blood draining from his face. "Come and take your sister's dead body. I'm going to the police station." Taki's world shattered. His sister, Rukia, gone. Court documents would later reveal the chilling final moments of Rukia's life. When she confronted Halimi about swearing at her brother, an argument erupted. She was furious, standing her ground, refusing to be belittled. In her anger, she told him to f*** off. That was all it took. Halimi snapped. He grabbed a large kitchen knife and, in a blind rage, lunged at her. The force was so brutal that it severed 2 of her arteries. Within moments, the life of 21-year-old Ruqia Haidari was stolen. Taki's haunting call was no longer just a brother's concern. It became the moment a nightmare was set in motion, one that would change his family's life forever. During the investigation, Halimi pleaded guilty, providing a chilling explanation to the police. He claimed he had grown increasingly frustrated with Rukia, citing her repeated refusal of his advances for sexual intimacy. He further complained that she failed to cook, did not keep the house clean, and often slept while he worked 7 days a week to support them. But his grievances could not justify the brutality of his actions. The system, however flawed, made it clear that no frustration could excuse the taking of a life. Justice eventually caught up with those responsible for Rukia's fate. Muhammad Ali Halimi, her husband and killer, was charged and sentenced to life in prison. A man who robbed Rukia of her life, her dreams, and her voice would now spend the rest of his days behind bars. But the case didn't end there. In a bitter twist of irony, Rukia's family had arrived in Australia in 2013. The very same year legislation was passed to prosecute anyone involved in forced marriage. 7 years later, in October 2020, Rukia's mother, Sakina, became the first person in Australia to face charges for forcing her daughter into marriage. Sakina, who once believed she was acting in the best interests of her daughter, pleaded not guilty. But after a day of deliberation, the jury found her guilty. The court sentenced her to 3 years in prison, with 1 year mandatory serve and the rest to be served in the community. The ruling sent shockwaves through the community, a stark reminder that forced marriage, even under the guise of cultural traditions or familial duty, would not go unpunished. Ruqia Haidari's story is one of lost dreams, stolen freedom, and unimaginable tragedy. But it is also a wake-up call. Her death shed light on the devastating consequences of forced marriage and domestic violence, issues often hidden behind closed doors. Her courage to stand up, her resilience in the face of oppression, and the justice served after her death sparked a conversation that can no longer be ignored. Ruqia's life may have been cut short, but her story continues to inspire change. It is a plea for freedom, for choice, and for a world where no voice is silenced and no life is taken too soon. That's all for today. Be sure to check out our other videos, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Take care and stay safe. Until next time.